Hi, my name is David Mulgrew, and I'll be defining the issue of tailoring games to have addictive psychology. Many video games contain a core loop of anticipation, challenge, and reward, referred to as the compulsion loop. This triggers dopamine, making the player feel good and seek to repeat the behavior. For some games, this is an accidental consequence of their game loop. For others, they deliberately tailor their game loop for the most efficient compulsion loop possible. Some developers have taken this to an extreme, with them employing teams and psychologists with their main goal being to improve the addictiveness of their games. In general, addiction is defined as a state of psychological or physical dependence on an activity or behavior. The term is often used as an equivalent term of substance use disorder, but can be applied to non-substance related behaviors. The addiction causes players to put the game before base needs such as friends, family, and work. Many games refine these techniques as a method of generating revenue, intending to addict players and then charging them to continue playing, often with small amounts that are easily dismissed that increase as the player progresses in the game.
I'm Callum Streets and I will now be covering the impacts. Studies have shown that addiction to games is causing an increase of poor mental health in young people. This and the distracting nature of games reduces productivity, pulling people away from work and creating an inability to focus. As people wish to escape the grasp of this issue, they look towards professional intervention and therapy, which incurs a great cost and puts a strain on medical services. As time progresses and gaming becomes more and more popular across the globe, more people are falling victim to these trends. However, in contrast to the negative impact, in 2016, Niantic released Pokemon Go, a game which promoted getting out and socializing during play. Studies have shown that this had multiple positive impacts on players' physical health, mental well-being, and cognitive ability.
My name is Hayden Hefford, and I'll be talking about why this is relevant to our course. As future game developers, we hold the power to shape player experiences. By focusing part of our research for this project on the deliberately addictive psychology of some video games, we give ourselves the knowledge to make conscious game design decisions. Most importantly, this research allows us to understand the consequences of those decisions. It's easy to say that we want to avoid manipulating people and foster positive experiences within our games, but this research allows us to understand how to avoid such malpractice. Conversely, it's also important to understand that there may be times in our careers when we are pushed to increase player engagement to meet metrics or revenue goals. Understanding the psychology around deliberately addictive games may help us to carry out such work while balancing moral implications.
I'm Ash Windsor, and I'll be discussing current interventions. Studies have identified limited efforts to regulate or propose interventions for these issues within the industry. Soroka also argues that the use of psychological research to manipulate consumers for profit generation is ethically problematic. Implementing a rating system, such as those introduced as the Pan-European Game Information (PEGI) system, for addictive psychology, would be infeasible due to the significantly increased workload of determining ratings based on the behavioural and psychological effects of game design. They identified that due to this, teaching gamers about their own exploitable psychological traits would improve their metacognition, the awareness and management of one's own thought. This would reduce the effectiveness of addictive game design, as it would allow the gamer to ask themselves, am I really having fun, and reflect on their own behaviour.
My name is Leroy Dobson, and I will be covering the outcomes of addictive psychology. The first outcome to consider is limits to screen time. By imposing these limits, we can reduce the chances of people becoming addicted to games. However, this also means that companies might see a decrease in their profits, as less addiction translates to less spending. It would also place restrictions on people's enjoyment of what many consider an art form. Next, we have limits to spending. If we regulate how much people spend on these games, companies will be less incentivized to create addictive content. This can prevent individuals from spending excessive amounts on games they're addicted to. Ideally, this would narrowly target companies leveraging players for a continuous revenue stream and not spending in general. In summary, regulating either can help mitigate addiction and protect consumers, but it may also impact the profitability of gaming companies.
My name is David Mulgrew, and I will be defining the ethical issues of loot boxes. Specific definitions of loot boxes vary in implementation. At their core, they require players to spend money for a chance of a reward. This often drives loss-chasing and reward-seeking behaviors that mirror gambling and often result in compulsive need to keep buying. In essence, all the problems of gambling are shared by loot boxes. Loot boxes are a specific type of monetization which is showing growth in the industry. What differentiates loot boxes and gambling is that gambling is tightly regulated, loot boxes are often not. Some countries have taken steps to regulate them and others are discussing it. This means that loot boxes are often targeted to children. Children are more susceptible to habit-forming and addictive behaviors. In some regions, gambling regulations also place restrictions on the amount a person can spend and force providers to warn players about the dangers. This is not true for loot boxes, allowing developers free rein to behave in a predatory manner. While it hasn't been widely studied, some researchers believe loot boxes form a gateway to problem gambling.
I'm Callum Streets and I will now be covering the impacts. Loot boxes are sold to provide users the chance to acquire different game content for a small, seemingly insignificant cost. Game studios, such as EA in 2019, often argue their distinction from gambling when legal discussions come into play. This has allowed them to remain almost entirely unregulated. This culminates into a large problem. They come with all the negative effects of gambling and gambling addiction, such as chasing losses to attempt to make even on their losses, spending and gambling to escape from negative feelings, damage to relationships and career opportunities, along with lying to others in order to hide the extent of their losses. But there's no regulation to prevent young children from being exposed. This can result in children gaining addictive tendencies early into their development, which could affect them for their whole life. The growing spending on loot boxes creates a very strong incentive for profit-focused game developers to put loot boxes and other microtransactions into their games, and players are paying the price. A study found that loot boxes are acting as a gateway to gambling addiction.
My name is Hayden Hefford, and I'll be talking about why this is relevant to our course. It's important for us as computer games programming students to acknowledge current concerns regarding loot boxes. The UK Gambling Commission stated in 2017 that the line between video gaming and gambling is becoming increasingly blurred. This could be seen as exploitation of young people, and it can lead to problem gambling behaviours in the future. The inherent harm this poses should encourage us as a group to avoid loot boxes when we plan how to monetize future projects. We must consider the potential benefits of loot boxes. As of 2020, loot boxes accounted for approximately 1/5 of all UK gaming industry revenue. Finding consistent revenue streams and funding is challenging, and using loot boxes could help struggling studios to survive. It's important for us to consider both sides of this pressing issue, and we will likely need to strike a balance between using loot boxes to earn money while avoiding making them predatory to make a consistent profit in an ethical way.
Hi, I'm Ash Windsor and I'll be discussing current interventions. One of the major interventions for this issue is to classify loot boxes as gambling. In Belgium, existing gambling law could be interpreted as including all paid loot boxes under the definition of gambling. The UK Gambling Commission, however, stipulated that only loot boxes that are paid for and provide items worth real-world money fall under gambling regulations. This approach is currently decided on a national level, with regulation differing between nations. There is no current coordinated stance on whether loot boxes should fall under existing gambling regulations. It has been suggested that a common standard should be created to provide uniform consumer protection. Zhao identifies that the current fines imposed by PEGI were of an insignificant amount to video game companies, with the threat of these fines not serving as a deterrent.
My name is Leroy Dobson, and I will be covering the outcomes of the ethics of loot boxes. There can be three broad outcomes from these issues. It can lead to loot boxes becoming regulated like gambling, banned, or being left as they are. If left unregulated, loot boxes can lead to serious issues and already do. They can contribute to problem gambling among adolescents and allow companies to exploit existing gambling problems for profit. Regulating or banning loot boxes can mitigate these risks, but may negatively impact the profitability of gaming companies, which can have a knock-on effect on games which don't include loot boxes and also employees. This is covered by Harvard Business School's $15 billion question and how many games rely on loot boxes, with some games having loot boxes amounting to 96% of in-game revenue.